Robert, and thank you everyone for kind of being here today. It's exciting to be speaking on this topic. And kind of in that light, I think the first kind of point I wanted to kind of suggest or ask, is park really the right word? When I got the invitation to speak on resilient waterfront parks, I thought, amazing, great, I love parks, but is this really the right vocabulary we should be using to think about our waterfront? As landscape architects, we obviously love parks, but they also have baggage. They have pastoral, picturesque baggage that we deal with all the time in New York. And we think about parks as a kind of classic quintessential central space, which is located just outside here of our kind of glorious roof deck. But these kind of parks and spaces involve lawn, they involve canopy trees, they involve lots of back benches, and these have really shaped and driven the kind of forms and regulations that drive waterfront parks within New York City. However, much of New York City's edge, which I think is a kind of much more interesting word, is nothing like this type of environment. And so I think parks is a great word, but needs to be expanded to really think about both the kind of diversity of ecosystems, the kind of harsh climatic conditions, the different uses, and the kind of dynamism of what is a kind of waterfront-driven world. So whether we talk about waterfront edges, we talk about get-downs, we talk about boardwalks, we need to really kind of expand the vocabulary that we use when we talk about resilient waterfront edges. So kind of speaking of parks and speaking of edges, what are the major kind of design goals? So I work for SCAPE Landscape Architecture. We work on a lot of different waterfront edges, both within New York, New Jersey, and other sites, both nationally and internationally. But in all of our work, what we really try to do is think about how can this edge, how can this space really anticipate climate change. Our work really revolves around designing multi-purpose infrastructure to mitigate risk, and that really speaks to Robert's statement about our edges need to do more. We really need to think about these as multi-purpose functional spaces that might provide lawn and seating, but also might provide resiliency benefits. But I would also really urge that we need to really expand our definition of risk to include ecological threats. We work in a kind of climate and context where the risks to people have been made very clear by Hurricane Sandy, but there's massive ecological risk also at stake. The disappearance of salt marshes that already exist, the lack of kind of spaces for those kind of ecosystems to migrate and move, and I think we need to integrate those into our kind of planning goals. We also need to really expand the client group. If we're going to mitigate ecological risk and anticipate that, we need to think about the other residents of New York City that aren't above the waterline, that are below the waterline, whether these are the kind of essential fish habitat kind of zones or the horseshoe crabs that come to the shorelines of the Rockaways and Palm Beach, or the mussels and kind of shellfish that live and kind of help stabilize our edges. These should all be our project clients. As designers, we try to embrace these species as our clients. And as regulators and policymakers, we should be advocating for the rights and the kind of habitats and spaces of these creatures as well. We can all coexist here. We need to design underwater. This is what a majority of our waterfront edge looks like, hard-edged bulkheads. And much of our work really tries to suggest that design does not stop and plan at the waterline. The waterline is a dynamic, movable thing, and we need to think, even in the smallest of zones and spaces, about how to design below water and create more transition between underwater and upland spaces. Whether that's in vertical section in highly urban areas in terms of adding texture and diversity, or that's kind of in more medium scales, beginning to actually create zones where marshes can begin to develop or migrate within our most highly developed urban areas. This is all possible. And we also need to recognize waterfront parks are critical infrastructure. We think about some of these large sites where there are huge kind of spaces. So one of our largest parks, the National Park Service, Gateway National Recreation Area in Jamaica Bay, needs to be funded, monitored, and maintained like the infrastructure around it. JFK, Belt Parkway, they have layers and layers of funding and monitoring and maintenance that's like written into the development code that needs to happen for our ecological resources as well. We need to engage people, designed to engage stewardship and kind of introduce people to both the risks of living on the waterfront, but the opportunities of getting your feet wet, getting dirty, like getting into the muck and really learning about these ecosystems, providing space for that. And we need to have visionary regulation around these spaces. Much of our regulation involves where we put this bulkhead wall, whether it's a foot out or a foot in of where it was before you began to design within this space. And that's kind of the reality of the world, but we also need to kind of project forward and suggest how can we regulate to encourage these types of sections. So rather than regulating purely in plan, we need to regulate in section and inspire kind of more transitional and dynamic conditions along the shore. We need to inspire piloting and testing, and we need to do it within 40 feet. So if you're a landscape architect working in New York with the kind of waterfront zoning code, you'll know that not every site is a wonderful, large, expansive, highly invested public park site. Our edges are critical. We can do these things within the smallest, narrowest of footprints, and the majority of our edge within New York City are these very, very narrow slices and pieces. And so I would encourage everyone today to expand the definition of park and think about trying to do more in smaller footprints.